Hello, welcome to the Honest Wargamer. I'm your host, Rob. I'm joined by the Twitch chat. Today's video is meant to be an incredibly helpful guide to playing Age of Sigmar in 2025. For the first time you've watched my videos, I stream Monday to Friday, and most of the videos I make while I'm also streaming. It's pretty cool, actually, because it makes it kind of a collaborative conversation. Today's video, or the way I'm going to go about doing today's video, is I'm going to do it in the form of a tier list. What I am going to do, or try to do in this video, is try to give you the easiest armies to play in 2025 for Age of Sigmar. If you watched the video I made on Monday, where I featured the fact that we had a 4 Bloodthirster list and a bunch of people running around with stone horns, this video really is dedicated to Tom. If you watch Monday's video, you'll see that in Monday's video, Tom, who for several years has been trying to play very complex armies, eventually just had his friend write him an incredibly smooth-brained monster truck list full of a bunch of Stonehorns and Kragnos. And I've never seen a person so elated, so happy to have got out of their own way and enjoy tabletop wargaming. And so I felt inspired. I was like, I'm going to make a video for everyone else, because you out there, you might have been struggling a lot with your army. You might be like, I don't really know what I'm doing. And it could just be because you are trying to think too much. Sometimes you just take the biggest things you can find and you just throw them in a straight line forward. And so that's what today's video is going to be about. What are the easiest armies to play in Age of Sigmar, and what will get you some good results, and how easy will it be to put together? I'm probably going to do a follow-up video on this. And actually write some lists out and explain some of the lists that I'll be kind of, talking about in this video, because I will be saying some stuff, and I'll be like, monster trucks. You might be like, what the hell is a monster truck? Like, isn't this a game of, like, fantasy soldiers? And I'm like, okay, yes. Sorry, that's an ogre on top of a stone horn that's running around, obviously. So some shorthand. So I'll make an additional video after this, which hopefully will be really helpful. And if you do like this video, please do leave some comments, like and subscribe. If you've played any of the Smooth Brain lists, let me know. And again, this is a good conversation. Listen, if you're someone who is offended by me saying these armies are easy to play, you are the sort of person this video is for, because you're not a smarty. That's what I'm going to say. Right, let's dive straight in and take a look at our tiers, shall we? So we've got the dumbest up at the top, smooth brain, small undulation, that's actually our medium tier, then average, then crafty goblins, and then the biggest brains full of wrinkles right at the bottom. Let's get started straight away. So first up, chat gets to decide which ones we're doing first, and they've chosen Oric War Clans. Obviously, their book has just come out. I have a review. I have a review of almost every army, I think, online for Age of Sigmar 4. I think there's like one I didn't do because I forgot it or something. But either way, Oric War Clans. New book came out. A little bit of a disappointment as a book, copy and paste from the first release. You're going to play them in 2025. Your book is underpowered. It doesn't have a lot of synergy. And unless you're, so it's two armies, really. If you're playing Cruel Boys, there's actually a lot of synergy and there's a lot of things you can do. But all those synergistic things and things you can do actually result in almost nothing actually happening. On the Iron Jaws side of that book, you have a lot of brutish power. So they're pretty smooth-brained, if you're excited about that. And they can do some output, but they're kind of outclassing everything else that you can play against them. So, because they're a combat army, primarily the Iron Jaws side, and they aren't as good as the other combat units. However, you can coalesce both of those two armies together and put them as a big war army. And if you're going to play them as a big war army, then you've got to do a lot of thinking, and you might have enough tools to maybe make the army play pretty well. So kind of at odds with how to play them, I'm going to put them as crafty goblins is where I'm going to put them, because I think when you put all of those pieces together, it's still going to be a difficult army to like win games with. And even choosing it, knowing that it's an underpowered army, makes you a bit of a smooth brain up here, right? Because you know it's not very good. But you're going to have to think a lot to make it happen. I'm going to put it in average because you're dumb to pick it. This is going to be an interesting, the comments on this are going to be very interesting. Don't forget, by the way, when I'm making this video, it's just for fun, all right? So try to enjoy yourself, right? If you're playing Iron Jaws, you have a good time. Or if you're playing Cruel Boys, you have a good time. You don't pick it, but you could maybe do some stuff with Big War. There we go. I'm going for average. Next up, we're doing Nighthaunt. So Nighthaunt in the beginning of Age of Sigmar 4 were the overpowered army that was super, super strong. They've taken a big nerf since that point, and now they're not quite as strong to play. They have a kind of an interesting mechanic where they ignore all rend, and also, so you've just got to make 4-up saves really to play them. And they also fly, and they can potentially have retreat and charge, which is pretty nice. Positioning is pretty important for this army now because they're not quite as overpowered as they were. So that's going to be quite important. So understanding the board state, but ultimately you're just spamming a lot of bodies. So what you would do is you take a ton of different like Grimgas Reapers or something similar, and then you just take 40, 60, 80, and you just putting them on the board and go grabbing objectives and doing stuff. I mean, so it's going to take an average amount of skill to do that. It's not super clever as list writing when it comes to that. To be honest, I think though it requires some play. So I think it's going to end up in a similar situation as this, where it's going to require some play to play the army, but ultimately it doesn't take a lot of a brain power. I'm going to put it up here. It doesn't take a lot of brain power to just make 4-up saves. So I'm going to just say small undulation, not the dumbest, but pretty dumb. You have, you can play this as again, this is a tier list. Maybe this is a tier list I'm designing for myself. So 2025, what army do I want to play? I want to play something more towards the top of the chart because I'm a dummy. So that's what I'm going to go for. So small undulation right there. All right, next up, we are going to run Seraphon. Now, Seraphon's an interesting one because when you think dinosaurs, you don't think smart. Apart from if obviously you've watched the original Jurassic Park, a bit clever girl. And it's a kind of similar situation to here. Seraphon don't necessarily have the combat punch power of some of the smoother armies. So Slaves to Darkness is a good example. They don't have that sheer volume of output. But what they do have is output in waves. They definitely, if you were running a slan and try and return models back from the dead, that's quite a hard play style to try to make work because the slan can return units or units at half size back from the dead. So your output that you can do with your kind of big heavy hitting units isn't super strong, and your army is kind of predicated on the idea that you're going to lose models and you're going to bring them back from the dead, which means you've got to lose, which for other armies who can just front load damage, who don't bring models back, not quite as difficult to do. So already is a lot of thinking. Then if you go the other side, right, and then if you start running Croak, who's just become really good in the latest Battle Scroll update, and we've got the Croak Nado on the go, that is again fairly smooth. You're just doing AoE mortal damage, but you do have to position Croak in the right way. You do have to put them in the right place. And then again, still Croak has got to do a lot of the work and push a lot of the tempo when you're trying to protect him. And again, most of the rest of your forces are doing something a little bit more difficult. So I actually think might be straight up in the biggest brains full of wrinkles section. It's definitely in Crafty Goblins. Definitely in Crafty Goblins. I'm going to come back to it because obviously this is going to be based on the game. So right now it's in Crafty Goblins, but I think it could be up here because protecting your key pieces is actually a really difficult playstyle to achieve. That's quite hard, understanding tempo, making sure you're putting things in the right place at the right time. That's actually pretty tough. So I'm going to put this down around these two sections. If this was 3rd edition, obviously it'd be straight up to the pink category. But right now I'm going to put in Crafty Goblins, and then we'll see what might move it around later. Not set in stone at the moment. All right, next up we're going to do Skaven. Obviously they've got their Age of Sigmar 4 Battle Tome, and it's out. It's had a few little amendments since it arrived, especially some changes to some shooting. But this is one of those armies which actually has a very complex playstyle and actually can really reward complex playstyle as well. So you've got a bunch of different types of lists you can run. Number one, you can just go for loads of shooting. That definitely moves towards the smooth brain category of playstyle. However, taking loads of rattling guns and stuff. However, you still need to protect those key pieces. You need to understand where if your opponent's going to try and hurt them. So that definitely kind of puts it around that category. But when you start to get into the Warp Seer, using 3 claw steps ahead, then maybe even running quad Vermin Lords and doing a bunch of stuff like that, you start getting into a much more complex play style, definitely as you get further into the game. So we're just kind of going to skip the shooting. Definite, and it's definitely got it's got quite a lot of fun like abilities and synergies that you can do, and you can be quite clever. Moving in your opponent's turn is super clutch. There's some really cool stuff you can do with that. So I'm going to actually put the Skaven probably in biggest brains full of wrinkles. You've got loads of fun stuff you can do with this army. Like I say, taking all the Vermin Lords is pretty dumb, but you actually have to be pretty clever with it. There's teleports, there's doing some fun stuff. You're actually fairly like tactile with it. The gun, just taking all the guns, just the dumbest way to play a game, really. Can I just delete you in the first turn, maybe the second turn, with just shooting you off the board? Obviously, that's ridiculous. So that, like, if we were just going to rate that list, we'd put it right up here, maybe even in pink, to be honest. But apart from that, Skaven as a book and as an army to play, I actually got quite a lot of choices. So I'm going to go for biggest brain, full of wrinkles. It's being pointed out that at this stage, maybe we need a different methodology for our tier list, and it should be more of an Axis-style system, because Flesh-Eater Courts is who we're doing next, and Flesh-Eater Courts prose is a really difficult problem, because you can take some very smashy full-front Usharan and just a ton of Morbeg Knights, Usharan and also Nagash and some Morbeg Knights. Those are legit lists that you could just throw around at people. But the problem is those legit lists are kind of not very good, right? That's like, they don't generally, well, at the moment at least, aren't necessarily like pinging big victories. And you have to really understand the tempo of how that army works to even really make it work. You've got a lot of resources to keep track of as well. So it's not a simple army to play, but also very much kind of like the Oric War Clans book, the reward for trying to do, it's not quite the same as Cruel Boys, where for Cruel Boys, you're trying to do a ton of different things to get very little reward. I think you get a little bit more reward out of Flesh-Eater Courts for doing all of the extra effort that you're putting in on the table. When you get to a table, some people don't have to put a lot of brain power into what they're doing. And some armies do. Some people really riff off that. They love the idea of all the clever things that they can do. And when the army really rewards it, brilliant. When it doesn't reward it, like in Flesh-Eater Courts case, or doesn't tend to reward it much. But I do think that maybe it's got a little bit more play than you could get out of the Oric book. So I'm going to put it in Crafty Goblins, in that you're going to be doing a lot of stuff, right? I think that's what you're going to be doing. You're going to have to like make a lot of things work and synergize to be good, and then you'll get some good reward. So it's going to take a lot of thinking. Next up, we're going to talk about ogres, because we haven't really put anything up into the smooth brain category yet, and we really need to. Ogres don't actually have a lot of utility on the tabletop. They don't have a lot of synergy between their different units, and so for a while, at least before the latest battle scroll, they definitely weren't very good. There was a point at the very beginning of Age of Sigmar, 4, where maybe you could take enough gluttons that you could overload people, but then they up the points. So ogres, because they don't have any real interactive synergy across how their army plays, doesn't really work very well. So Games Workshop just reduced the points on some of the big monster trucks, and we end up with one of the most beautiful army play styles to ever play. 2020, apart from the fact that they might redo ogres, that's a legitimate thing that I think, I'm not saying necessarily 2025, as in the model range, they might redo the model range, but somewhere 2025, 2026, we might see a new ogre release. Well, at least that's kind of my prediction. It's one of the oldest model ranges now in Age of Sigmar, and probably needs a model update. So before you do go jumping into 2025 and become a smooth brain destruction player, then, and smooth brain destruction play is very different. If you were saying, hey, I'd like to play destruction and go smash stuff, I would never tell you to pick up Oric War Clans, but I would absolutely say, go and pick up the good old destruction trucks. And the reason you've got Kragnos. Kragnos is the dumbest of all models. It requires no thought. It's got 3d6 charge and can just, with its own ability, just lift monsters off the board. It's the absolute pinnacle of non-achievement. Kragnos as a model, as a rule set, everything about it is ludicrous and an antithesis of intelligence. So it's right up there. And then when you're able to then make all the monsters also charge at the same time, you're going to be having a great time. And that's really important, because you're going to be having a great time. The Flesh-Eater Courts player is going to be trying to gently sacrifice units so that they can countercharge and get in at the right time. That's what they're going to be thinking. you are going to be thinking nothing. You're going to be eating pasty, maybe supping a beer, and you're going to be launching stuff at people, and you're going to be having the best time, right? That's the point of this video, is to say it's not bad to play that way. It's a legitimate way to play. You should be having a good time. This is an army to do it with. Go out there, 3d6 charge your little heart out. Okay, the next army we're going to talk about is currently a legal army, Beasts of Chaos. So Beasts of Chaos, if you don't know, in the summer of 2025 will no longer be match play legal, which is okay, because at least the tournament goers for Beasts of Chaos have no longer started to ever commit to the idea of playing this army smartly. The most competitive list that we've seen for Beasts of Chaos have been 70 to 80 Bulgors. Not Bulgors, Bestigor. Post the Battle Scroll release, we've gone down to just 70. Sometimes we've seen people throw in 6 Bulgor as well, but it's just the same unit repeated and then going and doing a ton of damage. That's it. Just Bestigors, 80 of them, run at your opponent and smash their face in. Incredibly high-end gamers with amazing success rates, including the world's most successful player at the moment in Age of Sigmar, Gavin Grieger, have been running 80 Bestigor because you don't need to think. Also, if you were to try to pick up this army in 2025, and this is really important, you'd be a dummy because they're going to get rid of the army. So why would you give them money for an army that's about to be deleted? So don't do that. So for that reason, it's going to go up into the tier, which I thought was going to be reserved only for Gargants, in that it's the dumbest. This is the smoothest brains of all smooth brains as an army, right at the top, but also don't buy it. I don't really know what the dumbest even means now. I think I've confused. Am I the dumbest? I'm confused myself in the tier list, but don't get this army. I think because it's not it is the easiest to play, and also it's going to stop being sold. So don't do this. I think that's the right place to put it. It's a confusing tier list. So next up, we're going to do Soulblight Gravelords. It's actually quite a challenging one to talk about because you can run a bunch of monsters and go along that route if you really want to, but actually it's probably a little it doesn't really work. It's not really a playstyle that you might want to hit. If you're talking about the playstyle for Soulblight Gravelords, it's based around the fact that units die, like Flesh Eater Courts. But unlike Flesh Eater Courts, they have, I think, a different type of utility, which means their recursion works a little bit more effectively for things like Fellbats, for just making it so your opponent has to waste resources. Age of Sigmar has a pretty low unit count. Therefore, your opponent doesn't really want to be taking some of their costly units and making them go chase around a bunch of bats, which are scoring tactics. It's kind of the same thing as you get with Hunters of Hornsea. And therefore, especially when you have armies that are like pumping very large, like monster trucks, the monster trucks don't want to be running around grabbing objective, chasing little bats around. They want to be hitting the big things, right? As an example. So that part's hard. Also, your army list, your unit choices are also really hard as well. Like Graveguard are obviously good, but they're really slow, difficult to utilize. Blood Knights are kind of good, but again, they need to be used in the correct way. Not all, some and most of the Mortarks, so like, your Neferata and your Manfred are pretty good, but again, they require a lot of thinking to utilize and work well, and the army is only having medium to okay results, even if you're thinking, even if you're trying your hardest. So I think for that reason, I think the juice, like with Cruel Boys and Iron Jaws, the juice isn't worth the squeeze. I personally don't think the juice is worth the squeeze for Flesh Eater Courts either. Like, I think for Seraphon, the juice is worth the squeeze, but it's much easier. Like, they're easier to play than you'll get with Skaven and Soulblight Gravelords. But I think when you do end up learning them really well, I think you can have a much more engaging time for yourself. So I think that's a little bit better. So I think the Flesh Eater Courts, Skaven, and kind of like Soulblight Gravelords have that same kind of like difficulty curve, but you just get a little bit more out of Skaven and Soulblight Gravelords to play. But I think, someone could easily just say that also about Flesh Eater Courts, probably. But I would say that Seraphon's a bit easier. So that's kind of the structure around that area, which I think is a good structure, honestly. Okay, next up, we're going to take Maggotkin of Nurgle. Now, Maggotkin of Nurgle is interesting because its rosters pretty much all units that do the same thing. They do melee output, obviously ignore Rotmire Creed. They do melee output, and They've got a good armor save. They've got a good ward save most of the time. Generally, the army tries to debuff stuff, and there are some very tight-knit synergies that you can run as well. You can just go for great and clean ones and a bunch of those and move them forward, or take a bunch of Blight Kings. But because the army hasn't been given any kind of like additional utility outside of like push it forward and hit, it's actually really smooth-brained, and it's pretty cool. Now, it's really difficult to use well. Event results are a little bit harder. So, like, for example, it's pretty much exactly the same conversation we're going to have with Slaves to Darkness, but Slaves to Darkness are given the output. These guys are just given okay survivability. So I'm going to put these guys into small undulation because I think this army is not necessarily great. It's good to okay. Like, you can play okay with it. Like, I would rarely expect to see, in its current iteration, without points drops, I would rarely expect to see Nurgle. When I see Nurgle get a 5-0 at an event or a 4-1, it's a surprise. It's like, oh, that's cool. Look, like you can Nurgle. That's pretty fun. That's why I expect them to be. But you can't, like, it's not because the players have any room to wiggle with their playstyle. You can't do all of the clever tricks you can with Skaven and Soulblight Gravelords. It's just push it in the middle. I haven't fully painted Nurgle army, and I just cannot bring myself to put it on the table because I can't imagine just getting whacked by my opponent for 5 turns. It feels fun. So, because I'm like, what's your out? Like, what's your clever trick? It's like, none. I'm just going to keep hoping you fail to hurt me. Which is kind of like, you have more tricks with the thingy. So, but you can, listen, if you love Nurgle and you're like, look, it's 2025, I just want to paint some green dudes, I just want to push him in the middle, and I'm not thinking very much, that's a great army to do it with. Because sometimes you'll do okay with it. So that's a great army to do it with. Go grab yourself a Nurgle army. Our next army is KO, Kharadron Overlords. They are a almost purely shooting army. They do have some melee units, but those melee units have some pretty significant problems in that they have very low survivability. They have high output. But KO, because it has a monosyllabic playstyle, very much like Nurgle, but is more difficult to play. So initially, my initial emotional response is to put Nurgle up in, not Nurgle, Kharadron Overlords into Smooth Brain, because it just does one thing. Like, it either shoots you to death or it doesn't. Those are your choices, really. But actually, in order to make just shooting you to death happen, you do have to go through a lot of steps. You have pretty low survivability, so that's a problem. Then also, you have a real difficulty with ranges and making sure you make the right target priorities and all that those other things. So then you'll get into around here. And I'd be also tempted to even say that it's more difficult because you struggle when you don't bring some things like Regiments of Renown, like we see a lot of people bring the Saviors of Cinderfall, or even the Black Talons as an example to make that see play. So now you've got to start thinking about armies outside of your own army to even make it see work. So I'm kind of tempted to put it down here. As it is, and then you can actually do really well with it once you understand how it works, and if you get the right matchups and you play into the right armies. You know, there's an argument that we started at the top here, and he's kind of worked his way down here. I'm gonna say it's average. I think it's very, very difficult to play, but what you do with it is very one note. Just blow your opponent off the board, and hopefully you've won the game in that regard. So I'm going to stick that around average. But like, if I was like, it's so one note. You know, I'd be tempted to put it. It's as one note as Beast of Chaos at the top in playstyle. So I'm going to put it at average. Sticking with the dwarf theme, we're going to talk about Fire Slayers. Okay, number one, they all look the same. Let's just get past that, right? That's really difficult, okay? They also need some different unit types as well. And you can't really do the Magmadroth spam. That would be really fun to do, and maybe would put us up here in Smooth Brain. But actually, their allegiance abilities are super, like, full. There's a bunch of stuff you can do with them. They've got a ton of priests with some very short, wholly within ranges. You've got to make sure your timing is right, and when you use all the right runes, and when you do all the active abilities. But because of the point shops that they've had recently, we've seen Fire Slayers do okay at a couple of events. And you can take a bunch of different Fire Slayers and build some really techie lists around how they work, which seems pretty dumb for some naked dwarfs who are looking to punch people in the head, right? And it's going to sound crazy, but like, Fire Slayers could be an army that you might want to pick up in 2025. They have very low representation, like so not many people play them. Therefore, it can be a little bit challenging for your opponent to play against them because they're like, I wasn't expecting that. Their output can be pretty good in the right situation, but I think once you understand this army really, really well, you could do pretty well with it, and it's got the juice in there if you do play it. So, but that said, yeah, I think it's around there. I think maybe. Yeah, I think Fire Slayers is one of the hardest armies to play, and it might also be worth it to play. That's genuinely what I think. I genuinely think it might be one of the hardest armies to play, but it might be worth it to play because I think it can do really well. As we saw recently, like literally one of the best players in the world, Jeremy Vissier. Shout out to Jeremy. I'm not sure if he's watching, but he's an incredible on-table player. He's so good. His understanding of the game is absolutely excellent. Multiple Worlds player for Team America, captain of Team America multiple times. Loads of GT wins under his belt. Played Fire Slayers at like a super hyper competitive AOS event very recently at Everwinter. Beat the other 90 people at the event. He's choosing that army. He's choosing that army in 2025, and he's winning with that army. So it does show you that the army has got not the legs, but it's definitely got the muscle to push through. Next up, we're going to talk Blades of Khorne. Blades of Khorne is truly the most dichotomous army probably in this list. Because Blades of Khorne is both smooth brain and the biggest brain full of wrinkles. So that's the thing to remember. So if you just take 4 Bloodthirsters, and that's absolutely, in my opinion, one of the most viable and fun armies you can play in Age of Sigmar 4 at the moment, which is, we're going to do a show where we talk about those in a moment, our top 5 dumbest lists. You can take this, so that puts it right up there. However, as soon as you move away from the Bloodthirsters, it becomes incredibly techy as an army. Wrathmongers might be too cheap, and definitely you might see more Wrathmonger builds in the future where it's just like, 30 or so Wrathmongers. That could be a play because they're a combat army that kind of outclassed in the combat category. And then their utility is based around using Blood Tithe. And they did get a Battle Scroll update, meaning you can use more than one Blood Tithe ability in a turn, but not in the same phase, which is nice. It's a nice upgrade to them. But in Age of Sigmar 4, we got about 25% less units on the board, which means you don't generate as much Blood Tithe because Blood Tithe for Blades of Khorne, which is their faction ability, is generated from units dying. And if there's not as many units to die, you don't get quite as many, right? So it's a little bit of a toughy one to rate. Obviously, I want to put it up here for Smooth Brain because I just want to say just play Bloodthirsters. And I honestly feel like Blades of Khorne players are really doing themselves a disservice. But shout out to Christoph this weekend, who I saw just get like a 4-1 with Blades of Khorne, working super hard to do that, only losing to the winner, Colm. I don't want to say Colin. Colm. So like it sits between the two. So it's somehow both Smooth Brain and also the biggest brain full of wrinkles in the world, which actually is super dumb because it's Blades of Khorne. If ever there was going to be an army that you want to be around this section at the top, it should be there. So I guess it's the biggest brain full of wrinkles until you're brave and then you're a smooth brain. And I guess maybe that's the trick, right? I'm going to split the difference and say it's average. Oh, no, it's not. I'm going to say it's the biggest brain full of wrinkles, but you should be at the top playing. The right way to try to win events is probably not 4 Bloodthirsters. So, but that is what you should be doing with it. You should just be taking 4 Bloodthirsters and having a great time. Next up, we're going to do Stormcast Eternals. Currently the most popular faction in play in tournaments competitively. Stormcast Eternals pose a real big problem for something like this in that there are definitely some units that are super good and you can just push them at people and that's normally pretty nice. But Stormcast playstyle isn't actually just pushing stuff at people. Long strikes aside and maybe a big dragon aside, which is definitely more bends towards the competitive edge. You also got Vanguard Paladors with Starstrike Javelins, and then now you have Stormdrake Guard, which again are just big things that you throw at your opponent. You can do some pretty incredible work. Same with long strikes, incredible work. So when you start talking about that stuff, you say to yourself, okay, that's pretty smooth, that's pretty easy peasy, but actually it's not true. You have to do a lot of, I don't say a lot of work, but I think they're more difficult to play than people give them credit for. I think they are a tougher army and can get caught out quite easy. They've got some really good key pieces, but it never seems over-egged, even though their competitive rate right now, or at least they're like the amount of 5-0s that they've got in Age of Sigmar recently has been really, really high. So they are definitely good, but if you were to try to pick up this army in 2025, this is an army of like nearly 100 war scrolls or whatever it is, 87 or 52 or whatever. I don't know what amount it is, but there's a lot of war scrolls in here. And immediately you're kind of perplexed because you're like, wow, that's a lot of stuff. But actually, it's one of the big dragons, maybe a Star Drake, long strikes, Vanguard Paladors, it's Vigilers. It's a roster of like 12 units versus like the other units, and so that can be a real challenge to kind of stick in here. I'm kind of tempted to put it in average. It's a bit of a coward's choice, like from me. It's a bit cowardly because like I would say it definitely requires play. And it is not just push it in the middle and just like do well with. Like with the monster trucks at the top, you can push them forward and win games, I think, and win tournaments maybe. But with this, I think you do have to work hard. But the units that you're using are strong, but they're strong if you understand how to use them. I think that's a fair thing to say. They're strong if you understand how to use them. And which I think is different to Flesh Eater Courts and maybe Seraphon, where even understanding how to use them, you won't get quite the output that you would want necessarily. So I'm going to put them as average. The next question I've been asked is to do Cities of Sigmar. And actually, I've then created, as you might see, a new category for this, because this is kind of the same conversation that you're having with Soulblight Gravelords and you're going to have with Flesh Eater Courts, where is the allegiance abilities of the juice worth the squeeze, right? You have a lot of allegiance abilities and a lot of units and a lot of stuff that you can do with the Cities of Sigmar army. Also, it's made, and almost invariably, they struggle to compete with anything else in any other part of the game. And they're struggling as an army as well. In addition to that, you can't build fun, smashy lists like you would really want to with like, when you're playing all the Bloodthirsters or all the monster trucks. You can't really build fun, smashy lists. So that sucks. So you've always got to try and play this really techie, really complex game with all these different units doing all these different things. Also, the army is really 3 different subclasses, whereas humans that interact with humans, it's elves that interact with elves, and dwarves that interact with dwarves. Now, to be fair and clear, the dwarves are currently really, really good, as are the elves. They're really excellent, but I'm pretty certain that both of those two armies, those two model ranges, will go away into the old world whenever the new Cities of Sigmar book comes out. Now, that could be wrong, but I would kind of expect them to, because they're currently being sold by both bits at the minute, and I don't think that's what they would want. So we'll have to see on that front. But right now, this doesn't fit into anything. It's complex to play, but that doesn't really benefit you in any way. It's got a large roster of models that might go away like Beasts of Chaos, but also that sucks because you don't know, and the strongest units are the units that might leave. And then when you do finally put all those pieces together, it's not that easy an army to do well with at all. So I would say it's really missing the mark at the minute. And as one of my favorite armies, I'm quite sad about it. And maybe that's why there's just this rewrite section here, but we'll have to see. But yeah, this is definitely, I think, of the list. Let me just see what's in the rest of the list. Of the list, I think this is easily the worst book structurally to get into in 2025. Obviously, there should be a new book around the corner in the next couple of years, sometime, we don't know. But yeah, that's not the one for me. Next up, Slaves to Darkness. Now, this has got a kind of similar story to Stormcast in that it's got an incredibly wide roster, but you only are ever taking 5 units. Okay, and that's nice because it goes all the way up into Smooth Brains straight away. You've got some of the best combat units in the game, Varangard and Chosen, with Fight Twice, high armor saves, and the ability to just for no reason get a 5-up ward save super easy from a Chaos Sorcerer Lord. You have the best War Scroll in the game in Be'lakor, which is great. And even an Archeon build is actually pretty cool, which is a big, large model running around doing some stuff. That does require more play, but definitely I think that the sheer volume of output, especially if you're playing in the mid tables, I think this is easily one of the easiest armies to pilot, because it's just, again, there's no shooting. It just is one note. It does combat. It does combat better than all the other combat armies, pretty much. It's faster than the other armies, which is good for combat. It doesn't do much apart from it's going to hammer you. which is kind of different. When we talk about OCR Bone Reapers, talking about an alpha pin versus an alpha strike, very different like play styles. And this is just like, I'm going to do some tactics and then beat you up. This has to be absolutely, and also the book just came out as well. This is a really wide roster. You might be super excited to play, to build Dark Oath. Don't do that. There's options to obviously build like Chaos Warrior bricks and do something fun there. That's quite cool. They're outrageous. We just saw Liberators do well at an event here, like literally where I'm located, like 2 units of 10. Shout out to Com. But if Liberators could be pumped up to units of 10, going up to units of 20, then you could build around those for Stormcast, but you can't. And there's a similar conversation actually for Fire Slayers and even really Uruks. If you could do Uruks 10-20, if you could do Brutes 10-20 versus 5-10 as like the amount of models in the unit, you'd be having some really interesting conversations. So I'm doing it. I'm sticking it in Smooth Brain, and arguably it goes there. But yeah, this is super dumb. And this is really important to remember, super fun. Listen. And that's the point of this tier list. I'm really confused on what the point of this tier list is now, but this is something to remember. This is easily the most fun you can have in Warhammer. You stick 10 Chosen with the Banner of Screaming Flesh inside of a Gaunt Summoner, you drop it down, you charge a bajillion miles, you then fight, and then you fight twice, and then you feel like a golden god. I need you to know that tactically it's like pressing a nuclear button. It's like there's no skill, right? I mean, building nukes and stuff probably requires a lot of like science and stuff, but it's like there's nothing there that's remotely clever, but that doesn't mean it's not fun. Wrestling, right? The Fast and the Furious franchise, okay? All of these things, not smart, okay? But they're really fun, okay? Some people are nerds and read books like me, right? Some people don't need to. Maybe that's you. And if you're doing that, then you can have the most fun, and you should do that. Next up, Idoneth Deepkin. Oh, now this is a toughie, Idoneth Deepkin, because Idoneth Deepkin are fairly fragile in some ways. Obviously, you can just go a load of turtles, and that's great, and you should. Okay, if you're kind of a player around this category, more of my people, then you can turtle it up, and you can have a great time. Just get turtling. That's what I say. But if you're wanting to play a much more like considered game, then I think Deepkin is at least sat around Crafty Goblins. They've got really good utility pieces in the Eidolons. And the list writing is pretty thin because the roster's quite small. Ishling Guard, definitely very popular. I think over Morsar Guard. They're very, very popular. And definitely people are rarely taking Thralls. They are sometimes taking Reavers and they'll like shoot and vanish and go back, which is good for tactics and also for keeping it real. But they're fast and they do combat, but they don't necessarily do combat, obviously, as well as the smooth guys at the top. And their fragility is real. Like, they genuinely can be pretty fragile. So that's something to be considerate of as well. So really fast and can be really good. And they're currently doing okay as well. This is a situation where, like, unlike Seraphon and Flesh Eater Courts, I mean, it feels weird having Flesh Eater Courts and Deepkin on the same line because maybe they should just go up to average, actually, because I don't think they require as much effort as Seraphon and Flesh Eater Courts, and I think you can do better with them like here. So they require the same amount of effort, I think the same kind of brain power level to make them work, but I think you can get the same kind of output with them, which is really making me question why Uruks are here in average, because I think our Uruks are just in like rewrite category. Now we've done it. But Big War exists. I think maybe Big War's the play there. So I think maybe I put these in crafty, because maybe Big War is worth it. I think now I'm changing it around. I'm going to put Big War down here because maybe they're worth it, which is interesting. All right, next up is Gloomspike Gits. Gloomspike Gits is an interesting book, and because while you can be really one-note by taking a bunch of Troggoths, some elements of this army are pretty well, you have to consider and think through quite a bit. You've got to decide where the moon's going to be and where you're going to try and get it to. You have to be conscious that if you do want to try and return models from the dead, you are going to have to maybe try to protect your Loon Shrine. Your Loon Shrine also is a problem for you. Where are you going to deploy it? Because your opponent can deep strike next to it, get charges onto objectives. So you can do badly also with, you can make mistakes with your army just with your terrain piece, which is why Bone Reapers players sometimes don't even bring their terrain piece to the games. So I would say it's not, and it's definitely changed as well. When we first saw how cheap rock guts were at the beginning of Age of Sigmar 4, obviously just taking 18 rock guts and just sending it at people is kind of the same situation as just taking a ton of rattling guns. Doesn't require any thought, and it's not very clever. Obviously, the honor guard ability and making it reduce down attacks, maybe taking Trug, and some of those other elements definitely make this army quite difficult to necessarily pick all the right pieces. Do you take Scragrot? Do you take Trug? Are you going to go Trug boss? Are you just going to have the rock guts? And are you going to start adding in the gits as well? That's a great question. So I think there's actually the list building reception to this is now more interesting. Post all the battle scrolls and the points updates, I think we end up in a more interesting 2025 if you're a Gloomspike Gits player. Plus the book is about to come out, so I'm a little bit loath to right now say anything about this book for 2025. Yeah, I don't know what I would do for 2025. I don't think you can smooth brain it. But I'm going to say right now, it's very obvious what is strong and what you could take. You could just take a ton of dudes and have a good time, a bunch of rock guts and just go smash in and move around with some Moon Clan. But I'm going to say it takes about an average amount of skill. That's what I'm going to say. I think it's a little bit more difficult to pilot than some of these other armies, but your rewards are... I think it's definitely more difficult to pilot, but you might even get better results than things like Nurgle. So yeah, I think Gits are here. But obviously, we haven't even talked about if you actually want to take the goblins, if you actually want to go Boingrots, if you actually want to go spiders, which is much more difficult to play, then they've got some real range. But I think that they've got a really big roster, makes that really challenging to play. Some of the units don't necessarily stand out as well as you get with Slaves. Like Slaves Dance, you take Bellicor. Like, when it comes to Gits, what leader you're taking is actually a good question, actually, and has got a lot of variety. So they're nowhere near as smooth brain as that. So yeah, I'm going to put them in average. Okay, next up, we're going to do Hedonites to Slaanesh. And Hedonites to Slaanesh is a super interesting army. Very fragile, with an allegiance set that's pretty thin and lackluster. And actually, a bonus to your opponent, kind of. It's not quite as bad as it was touted to be, which I did say. You can smooth brain the fuck out of this if you want. If you want, you could just take 70 Bliss Barb Archers and some Bliss Barb Seekers. Shout out to Tom Guan, based in the USA, second most successful AOS player. And also, can we just shout out, let's be really clear right now, the current most successful AOS player in the world is running the army in the dumbest tier, 70 Bestigor. The second most successful AOS player in the world is running 70 Bliss Barb Archers and a bunch of Bliss Barb Seekers. Just be really clear about that, right? Like, the easiest path to victory is the dumbest. And you need to remember that. You need to focus on that in your gameplay. Sometimes you can say to yourself, maybe I could do something clever. Ask yourself, is that what the pros do? Because the answer is no. Okay, but apart from that, they have a very complex set of abilities that interact with each other and really hard to use. They feel like crafty goblins. They're very fragile, so maybe they feel like they're even lower. The reward that you get out of trying to get all those things to happen can feel really weak. Yes, Glutos is pretty good with the Painbringers, but your opponent has to want to engage with those elements and do it in combat. So that feels like it's got some hard matchups. So it's a real tough book. I'm going to say that it's definitely, I feel like this is a hard army to play. I'm going to say that. I'm going to say it's definitely crafty goblins. I'm going to say the reward that you get from it, I don't know if it's as hard as these. Because you've got some big power pieces. You're quite punchy. I think it's a crafty goblin. I think it's difficult to use. Yeah, I think it's difficult to use. It's got some really poor choices in units in the book as well, so it's quite complex to pick the right units. Even picking quote unquote the right units is nowhere near as obvious as Gits, Stormcast, Slaves to Darkness. Because actually, there's a really good argument for people are like, I love Shalaxi. Some people are like, hate Shalaxi. Some people are like, I'm all Glutos all day. Some people are like, I'll never use Glutos. So the Slaanesh players themselves can't even decide, which is pretty funny that they're tortured by their indecision, and very, very thematic, so well done to them. So yeah, I'm going to put it as a crafty goblin army. It's the chat saying, don't forget, if you are watching this video, work dumber, not harder. All right, next next army. We're going to do Ossiarch Bone Reapers. Ossiarch Bone Reapers, super interesting army, high armor saves, good allegiance set, Catacross pretty much mandatory. Had a pretty massive nerf to Death Riders that were really good at doing an alpha pin. Alpha pin's where you throw all your units at your opponent struggles to get out of where they're pinned in, they're locked in. It's basically how you would play Spearhead. You just pin your opponent in, they can't score any points, you win the game. But like that's what an alpha pin is. So they were really good at that. They're still kind of okay at that, and they've still got some really good key pieces. You've got the Mortek, not Mortek, the big guys with the axes. What are they called? Anyway, whatever they're called, those guys, big unit of 4 of those. And also we're seeing the Mortek crawlers are also featuring pretty heavily in some lists as well. Now the Mortek crawler list is more difficult to use than you would think. You got to get the right like target priority. That's pretty important. So OCR Bone Reapers are really interesting because they definitely have all of the abilities and they've got the high armor save, so they don't have the kind of, we just talked about Sinesh. Sinesh have a fragility problem. Bone Reapers at least don't have that, but they are an elite unit army, so they really do struggle with board presence in some cases, which is why big bricks of 10 Death Riders, or 30 of them, would really cover the board. So I think for Bone Reapers, I think they take a little bit more play, and they kind of remind me of like Gits in some ways. But I'm going to say smaller undulation. I'm going to put them up here. I think ultimately the high armor saves, the list writing is pretty self-explanatory in many cases. I think those are all pretty clear on what you're going to build and pick. You do have some options. You can always just stick Nagash in there. You can go super smooth brain at the top if you want to, which is still a build. So yeah, yeah, it would be really tempting to put them up into smooth brain actually, but they're definitely doesn't require too much. But they do have a lot of resources. They have a lot of things that they can do in the game. So I want to just make sure that's clear. So they definitely have more options than playing Nurgle. Super easy to build and paint if you wanted to play them in 2025. Pretty cool army. Next up, Disciples of Tzeentch. Disciples of Tzeentch are interesting because they do have a lot of options. Destiny dice, they're one of their core mechanics are not difficult to use. They're super cool. They're cheater dice, but they are a resource that's fairly limited, and you got to be really conscious about using it. You also have to protect your big chickens, which are not necessarily super survivable if you're running Kairos or you're running a Lord of Change. They're also fairly overcosted, at least in the Lord of Change's role for what he does. He's basically a Slan with extra steps, but is a lot more points. But then you go into the key units. We've just seen the Horrors get a massive nerf, or at least points-wise, but probably still pretty useful. But the ability to use Horrors, especially when they're now more expensive, is still, you still have to understand how they work, and it's quite complicated to do. Your tempo is difficult to achieve. You don't necessarily have big punchy units unless you're running something like a bunch of Zangor, which people feature. And generally, competitively, they've fallen off since we've seen them see play pre the Battle Scroll. So I'm just going to say that I think that they are definitely the biggest brain full of wrinkles. It's a hard list to write, even though Kairos is pretty much auto-include. It's a hard list to write. And then you're definitely now toying between if you want to go more fighty or if you want to go more kind of defensive. And even then, neither of those two playstyles now necessarily match up to how you want them to play. So definitely a tough army to play, definitely a tough army to build and write. Some real options, though, when you do start to play them. Just during the middle of the tier list, I have been asked, actually, someone in the comments has asked me where they can get Honest Wargamer dice. Some people don't know. If you go on the honestwargamer.com, you can see that we've got our new Pearl dice that are coming out, and we have those objective markers that you can see. We sell sets of 8, unlike other people who sell sets of 6. So they're available on the honestwargamer.com. If you want to go check it out, I'll include a link below. And we also do faction-specific tokens, which I think some people have missed. So it's a set of 8 tokens, themed 1 to 8, based around certain armies from the Mortal Realm. So you can see a Skaven one there, or Ratmen, sorry. Then you can see some wood people and stuff. So feel free to go and visit and let me know if you like them. Next up, Sylvaneth. Okay, Sylvaneth is the biggest brain full of wrinkles army, straight up. Super hard to use. Maybe it's crafty goblins. List writing is super easy. Because your recursion is almost entirely built around a Lariel, like you're bringing units back from the dead. You take a Lariel, then you take a Lariel, you take some Colonel Hunters, you take Belthanos, he's really good, and your list is basically written itself. Now, there are other versions of this list, so you can build super smooth brain, Alarielle 4 Durthus. And who isn't going to run that? That's super good. You should do that. That's going to go in my smooth brain list video. Absolutely. Alarielle 4 Durthus, great fun. But with this army, same as the other armies that really rely on dying to come back, then you're in a really tough position where you got to keep Alarielle alive, or she dies, she comes back again, got to keep her alive the second time. It's a 4-up as to whether or not you're going to bring models back from the dead, and sometimes you're just not going to do that. Therefore, this army can really lose tempo really fast. That's really challenging. In addition, you have trees that you put down, the Sylvaneth Wildwoods. And the Sylvaneth Wildwoods, when they go down, they're also a slingshot objective for your opponent to charge towards, hit, like be able to do a bunch of clever stuff. So you've got to be really clever when you put your trees down. So your main ability and also your teleporting, most of your abilities are based around those trees. Now, they did do a battle scroll update. I'm actually going to change this up. Even with the battle scroll update and they're giving them extended range, this is still a super challenging army to play. Very, very challenging. But it's worth it. It's absolutely worth it to play. If you play this army well and if you roll 4-ups, you're going to smash and do okay. So it's definitely an army that can sometimes win events, but not as often, because if you're always needing to roll 5-ups, when you're playing one game with your clubs, 4-ups, sorry, playing games with your games with your friends at a club, that game is won. But you've got to do it 5 times in a row at an event. That becomes likely that one of those games, it's just going to fall apart on you, and then you're going to have to try and scramble to be able to still win the game. That's going to be really hard. So definitely a very tough army to pick. Next up, we have Lumineth Realm Lords. Lumineth Realm Lords do have a ton of different abilities, as well as a wide roster of units to choose from. Therefore, already you're getting a bit of analysis paralysis if you are a smooth brain champion like me. Okay, so you're like, oh, it's a lot of stuff and a lot of things, which is true. The big guy himself is pretty good, so Techlist, although people will tell you he's not, even though he features in good lists that win well at events by good players. So he's good. Sentinels are great, and some of the other stuff is sort of solid as well. With the points reductions, we're also going to see the big Cow Mountain, Spirits of the Mountain, and also the infantry unit do really well as well. But ultimately, it is an army that relies and works off its different synergistic abilities and being able to stack them on top of each other. But the reward is really brilliant for these guys. So I'm going to maybe put these into kind of the average tier, very much along with Gits. Same thing. The units you can take are a little bit maybe more diverse than Gits and Stormcast, but your reward is the same. If you know how to play them, you can work really well with them, and they can do really well. And they're definitely nowhere near as fragile as something like Sinesh or Flesh Eater Courts. So yeah, they're very, very strong. I'd argue to put them into small undulation, but actually they still require a lot of understanding how they play to make them work. And they don't necessarily have like auto picks, like especially now with battle scroll changes to different units as they previously did. So still very strong, still very good, still very effective. But they're not, when everyone tells you that they're the biggest brain full of wrinkled players, that's super bullshit. That's not true at all. Daughters of Kane, next up, second last. Daughters of Kane is super tough to rate because they have a limited roster, a bit like Idoneth Deepkin, but they have a really high kind of potential, especially if you go like Witch Elves. You have a potential huge volume of output you can get from Fight Twice, a ton of different ways to get attacks. If you go back and watch my review video, you can see you get like up to 200 mortal damage doing attacks from a unit of Witch Elves. The problem, like Sinesh, is survivability on that front. Now, they do have Morathi Kane, and it feels like taking Morathi Kane feels very much like you auto-include like you would with like a Catagros, like you would with a Be'lakor. So then your list writing is a little bit more simple. And you say to yourself, okay, cool, list writing's really easy. Can you build a big dumb list like Monster Trucks? No. Okay. Do you need to understand how your army plays with itself and around each other? Then the answer is yes. So that's quite complex. Also, fragility is an issue as well. So I think ultimately I'm going to put this into Crafty Goblins, because the output is maybe worth it long term. It's really hard to put on the table. It's loads of tiny interactions as well, small bases, models that fall over. This is like a quite heavy mental load army. that's quite challenging to play. So I'm going to put that there. And that's it for the dumbest tier list 2025. Or this list became slightly confusing as we ended up going through it, because I really just wanted to talk about, maybe it's a different video I should be making. Maybe the video I should be making is, here's my top 5 favorite dumb lists that you can run in 2025. And that's a good video that we'll definitely do next, right? But it was also a nice way for me personally to help identify the strengths and weaknesses of different armies, even if it's in shorthand. And hopefully it's also been helpful to you as well. Because looking at this list, I think I really start to understand, and I mean, I do this every week, so I think I do understand why armies do well. Because sometimes it's not just like this army is good, it's why is this army good? Like, what are its strengths and weaknesses? Where does it fall down? And like, one of the things people ask me a lot is, you know, what's a good army? And I'm like, what's your play style? Because actually good armies that are really good, like Fire Slayers, we talked about Fire Slayers, right? Fire Slayers, played by one of the best players in the world, at the top end, can beat almost everybody when played by that singular person, right? But the most successful players generally tend to dumb down their lists. 80 best to gore, a ton of Bliss Barb archers. They tend to dumb them down and just go for it, right? Because there is oftentimes a strength in not engaging with minutia, right? You got a 3-hour game, it's in a tournament, sometimes it's loud, the tables are low, not the TSN arena, by the way. But like, you know, it can be an overwhelming experience. Just putting them on the table, rushing your opponent is a genuine, legit tactic. And also a legit tactic for you to think about what would happen when that's why cities are just in there as absolute garbo. Because when you just put your stuff down and someone just rushes you, like, how do I get out of this situation? And that's the problem, right? So anyway, I hope you've enjoyed this video. Do let me know in the comments below. Thank you to everyone on the Honest Wargamer Patreon for the support. If you do support me, thanks very much. I appreciate you loads. And you should join my Patreon. That'd be ace if you want to do that. That'd be cool, because it helps me make more videos in the future. 2025, going to hire an editor and make more videos. So thanks very much. See you soon. Bye.